He has covered pro football since 1992, is a selector for the Pro Football Hall of Fame, author, and Stanford grad. Jason Cole, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here. What's going on?
Not that much, living the dream, as they say. Jason, you wrote a fantastic book on John Elway. We were just joking around. I picked it up, finished it in a couple of days. And it was great for me personally because Elway was before my time. So Elway was one of those quarterbacks where, I hear his name thrown around in the Hall of Fame, and everybody always talks about how great of a quarterback he was and all this stuff. And I can go back and watch the YouTube highlights and see some of his top plays. But getting to know Elway as a person was one of my favorite takeaways from your book. And so I have to ask you, why John Elway?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, he's my favorite quarterback. I'm not saying he's the best quarterback of all time. That's a whole different argument. But he's my favorite. So um, he's my age, my era. I went to college with him. I'm from Southern California, from basically the same area of the world where he grew up. So there's a lot of connections on a personal level for me. And there are just some athletes who they just capture your interest. Sort of like when I was growing up, Magic Johnson. When I played basketball, that's many pounds ago and many years ago. When I still was playing basketball, like I imagined myself being Magic Johnson, and even if I'm only 5'11", like that's who you dream about being. Or you go out and you want to play football. I learned to throw a football watching James Harris as a Ram. So you know, certain athletes just do that for you, and Elway is one of them. And I thought he has an incredible story, along with being a champion. And then when he decided to take on the responsibility or the challenge of being a front office guy and being a general manager, I thought, God, this kind of puts it over the top. I mean, this guy's got an amazing legacy. So you put it all together, and I was like, let's do it. Let's go for it. So I spent a couple of years doing the research and eventually wrote the book, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback about the writing, which really, really makes me happy.
I always like to ask anytime I interview an author who writes a book like you did on Elway, just the amount of effort that goes into it, because I think it helps the audience appreciate your work a little bit more, just if they know the amount of effort that went into putting together something like this.
Well, I mean, you talk about you're doing 200 interviews. You're doing research, reading old articles. You're finding everything that you possibly can find out about somebody and turning over every stone, because part of it is you've got to find something that's different that hasn't been published or hasn't been talked about. Some kind of story about this athlete, this person that you're writing about that nobody knows. Because if it's something somebody already knows, why are they buying the book? Like, what is the sales point if I'm not telling you something that's new about this guy? Um, and I think it's a real challenge to get inside of people's heads, and you don't even do it by talking to them especially well. There's a really great story that was once written. It's kind of considered the master class in feature writing, and it was Gay Talese is the author who wrote about Frank Sinatra, and the title of the article is Frank Sinatra has a cold. And what it was is Frank Sinatra was sick at the time. He was miserable. He was a bad spot in his career. And Talese goes to write an article about him, and I think it was maybe for Vanity Fair. I can't remember what the magazine was, but he goes to write an article about it, and Sinatra refuses to talk to him. He just keeps putting him off, and just doesn't want to do it. Is not in the mood for it. Is miserable, and ends up that Talese talks to like 60 people and writes this amazing feature about Sinatra, because he's able to get into Sinatra's head through all the people that he's chatted with. And I think that that's really the art of great writing, because most people, when they talk about themselves, they're not telling you the whole story. And sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's not. And sometimes they just like they don't like talking about themselves. Um, they're not that egotistical, even though they're really prideful people. Um, so you've got to find other ways to understand who they are.
Have you or did you talk to Elway at all for the book?
Oh yeah, yeah. I spent time with him, so and he was good. You know, he's terrific. But again, he's not. I don't know that he's terribly introspective. He can be at times, but you've got to really have good information to get him to unload some insight about himself and to be a little bit what you would call emotionally naked, and put yourself out there. Most people are really that's especially somebody. I would just say this, especially someone who has been interviewed as many times as he has over the course of his life, and during most of those interviews was intentionally guarded because he didn't want to give away too much. You know, when you're playing sports and you're playing competitively, the art of it is don't tell everybody everything you know. You know, don't tell everybody everything that's going on the field. Don't let them know about the mistakes that are being made by your teammates or other players. You've got to protect those guys in order to keep those guys on your side.
Yeah. Well, Jason, let's get right into it. So John Elway, as a high school freshman, there's kind of a funny story about how he actually chose to play quarterback. So maybe let's start there.
Yeah, didn't want to play quarterback. Um, is going out for the high school football team as a freshman. Well, even before that, when his dad put him in youth football, his dad didn't coach him, and I think that's a really important point. His father Jack never coached his youth teams. You know, not Little League, not Pop Warner or whatever version of football that was. He didn't coach him in high school. Didn't coach him in junior high or any of that kind of stuff. He left well enough alone. He was a coach himself, working at the college level. So he just didn't have time for it, nor do I think I kind of consciously think he didn't want to be involved. He wanted to let somebody else do the work with his kid, and not interfere with that father-son relationship, which is different when it's a coach-player relationship. But his son liked playing running back because when he was young, he was faster than everybody else. And in the early 70s, the early to mid 70s, when he's first really learning about football, if you know that era of football, it's running the ball. It's not throwing the ball. Um, so it wasn't really, really exciting to him. So all of that put together, he's playing running back and playing running back, and he gets to freshman year in high school, and his dad is dropping him off for the first day of practice, and he says, "What position are you going out for?" And I tell this basically this entire chapter about how when John says, "I want to go out for running back," his dad puts the car in park and tells him basically, this long way, takes about 10 minutes. Running back ain't your future. You need to play quarterback. You need to take advantage of the talent that you have at quarterback. The speed that you have now is not going to be the speed that you have later. The game is going to change for you, and running back is just not a great future for a kid who profiles like you. And John understood that, or sorry, Jack, the father, understood that a little bit more because as a college coach, he was constantly scouting kids who were teenagers, right? And constantly like saying, okay, what does this kid project to be if and when I get him at the college level? And so he's just giving him advice saying, quarterback's the place to play. And John was like, this is really boring because they never throw the ball. And especially at the high school that he first played at. It was Pullman High School in Pullman, Washington. They ran, I think, a single wing offense, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a while since I read the book again, but I think it was a single wing offense. And in the single wing, you like throw less than 5 passes a game, unless you're way, way behind. So he ends up like, his freshman year, not throwing the ball very much at all. Doesn't really he's a quarterback, but not in a program that would serve his interest. And as luck would have it, his dad got fired at Washington State. They end up having to move to Southern California, and he lands at a high school where, at the time, very uniquely, they're throwing the ball 30, 40, 50 times a game. And now all of a sudden, John Elway can allow his talents to shine because he's in the right place. And happens chance made that a reality, not some coach in Pullman, Washington going, "Oh my God, look at this talent. We're going to make this kid a quarterback and we're going to throw the ball all over the field."
I'm always fascinated with how many stars have to align for certain people to be in certain positions to be successful. And actually, right before this interview, I watched so NFL on YouTube had like a little mini documentary on John Elway, and he was quoted as saying they were interview. I don't know at which stage of his career, but he was being interviewed, and he said, "Listen, if I never went to Granada Hills, which was that high school in LA where they threw the ball a ton," he said, "I probably wouldn't be playing football right now."
That is
And
that
so,
is true. That is all very likely true.
I mean, that's just I always find it fascinating. I mean, even looking at someone, we recently highlighted Aaron Rodgers on the podcast. Say what you will about his performance this year, but an equally cool story in terms of stars aligning and in terms of what had to go right for Rodgers to, end up being who Rodgers was. There was a scout who happened to go one of his games and spotted him. They're trying to scout a tight end on his team, but saw Rodgers and decided to pull him over to Berkeley. I mean, it was a lot of things happening at the right time for Rodgers to become who he is, and similarly for Elway.
Yeah, I mean there is serendipity. Um, there's a lot of serendipity that goes with any athlete's success, and who they run across, who they run into, who they don't. I think we oftentimes confuse that there is some kind of straight line progression that is easy for athletes. Like if you're physically gifted, somebody's going to find you and you're going to train here and you're going to do this and you're going to do that and you'll get your chance to play in the NFL. It ain't that way. There's just depending on where you're from, depending on who your coach is, depending on can that person parlay your passion. Do you have a parent who can parlay your passion to do something? Especially when you're talking about football, because there's so much pain and sacrifice that goes into playing football. It's not fun. Um, Hitting a baseball is fun. Um, Shooting baskets is fun. Those sports are very different. Now they have their own drudgery. Don't get me wrong. Um, but it's easy. I think it's always a little bit easier, the fun of sports in those kinds of activities versus one where you're either getting hit or you're hitting somebody else for a living, and you got to tolerate that. You have to have a special kind of desire to make it work in football, and there is a very strong gladiator mentality to football that guys have to have, and a toughness that they have to have to make it. And that has to be fueled in very particular circumstances. Again, there's a lot of luck that goes into this, a lot of survival that goes into this for football players to make it, and that's why you get guys from all different levels. It's much different than the other sports.
So we'll get back to Elway, but just staying on the topic of quarterbacks and making it to the NFL, I think you had a sentence in your book that was a fact. It was like 3.5% of all quarterbacks ever drafted made it, won a Super Bowl or made it to the Hall of Fame. I believe the stat was
That's out of the first.
and that
That's guys drafted in the first round.
in the first round, right? And so
Yeah.
that's always been, I've talked to so many people about this, about drafting quarterbacks, and why even in this age of data and analytics, seemingly we have every stat that we could ever possibly want, and we still can't get it right in terms of being able to draft franchise quarterbacks in the first round.
Mhm.
What do you? I mean, you have a whole section in the book that goes into it a little bit more, but what do you think most teams struggle with when they're evaluating quarterbacks?
Well, I think they struggle with everything with it. Okay. There's no, I I mean, it's the single hardest position in the world to play and to pick out, and I'm not talking about just the physical part about it, but the mental part about it, the leadership part of it, and the amount of scrutiny that you go with it. I was listening to a podcast with Alex Smith today, the former 49ers number one overall pick, who was taken the same year as Aaron Rodgers, and he talked about not just the fact that he had seven different offensive coordinators in his first seven seasons, so he's never really progressing in an offense and learning that offense as a whole and getting anywhere, right? So that's the frustration on its own, or the fact that he's with a sort of semi-dysfunctional organization that's going through quarterbacks the way people go through underwear. It's also the pressure that of being the number one overall pick, let alone being a first round pick, right? And all the mental gymnastics and games that go with it, and the pressure that you put on yourself. Um, so there's a combination of, does your organization know how to build a team around a quarterback and make the job easier, combined with can you handle the pressure of having to, having all the scrutiny upon you, combined with, do you have good coaching? Do you have some luck that goes with it that guys stay healthy for a period of time? Um, Look, Archie Manning, Peyton's father, is one of the most talented quarterbacks to ever come out of the college ranks. And if you ever watch tape of Archie Manning, he could throw and he could run. I mean, he's an amazing athlete. He's never going to get anywhere close to the Hall of Fame, and didn't get anywhere close to the Hall of Fame. Was never really considered because his career was garbage. And not garbage because of his talent, but garbage because he was with a complete crap organization that couldn't get out of its own way. But he was loyal to them and stayed hung with it because it was in his basically his home, not his hometown, but his region of the world where he grew up, and he wanted to have his family and wanted to develop his business interests. So being a member of the New Orleans Saints was important to him, even if the organization was complete crap. So, there's just so much of that. And then there's the personal side of, do you have the raw talent? And I'm not talking about, can you throw a deep out? I'm talking about, do you have the ability to process the game fast enough um, to handle it and to play in it? Like, you know, Mark Sanchez, terrific athlete, first round pick, Jets, um, and had a really good, solid career when you think about it. But he was missing that last little element of, when you come to the line of scrimmage and you're surveying the defense and you know where your offense is supposed to be, and can you count it fast enough? Like, can you get to the line and know where everybody is and just be able to see it? And he wasn't good enough at that part of the game. And I'm not even sure he knows that he wasn't good enough at that part of the game, but you saw it play out. Whereas Brock Purdy, who is not an overwhelming athlete in terms of being able to throw the ball, right? Like, he doesn't throw deep outs. Like, he doesn't have this giant arm. I mean, he's not a big human being. He's maybe 6 feet tall. I look at him eye to eye, and I'm 5'11", right? So, he's not overwhelming physically, but he sees the field and he anticipates as fast as anyone I've ever seen play that position. And I'm including Dan Marino, who I covered, and John Elway, who I wrote about, and Peyton Manning, whose entire career I pretty much saw, because I covered his first game and his last game. And Tom Brady, who, I covered, his entire career. Like, if you just look at how fast can a guy process it, Brock Purdy's as fast as anyone has ever been. And that allows him to play and overcome the things that he lacks. And so I sat down with Belichick one day, and he made me wait 11 hours or 13 hours. I can't remember how long it was. He made me wait a long time to get an interview. But I remember him distinctly saying late night in his office one time, yeah, the two most important things if you're a quarterback is you better be a good decision maker and you better be accurate. Because if you can't do those two things, you can't play. And that's just the reality of it.
I mean, do you think that there will ever come a time where teams get better at projecting quarterbacks? I mean, you write about it in the book. You just mentioned it. Drafting quarterbacks, arguably one of the toughest jobs in the world. And when you combine that with the pressure of a fan base and an organization, I mean, we saw it with Elway in his, when he stepped into the executive role at the Broncos and some of the whiffs that he had, and Paxton Lynch comes to mind. Do you think that teams will ever get better, or is it just one of those things where it's, humans are unpredictable and they always will be, and you know what, there will be plenty of more busts in the first round?
There's always going to be more busts than not because um, overwhelmingly people lose more. People fail much more in professional football than they succeed because what is judged as success um, is a very rare quality of you've got to, either you got to win Super Bowls and do it multiple times, or you have to put up stats that are so outrageous over a 5 to 7, 8, 10 year period of time uh, that people just can't help but say that you're good, right? It takes forever for somebody to to be acknowledged as a successful quarterback. And I think that, again, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of factors that go into a guy being successful. Look at Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold always had talent. He ended up in bad organizations, at least the first two places that he went. And he finally ended up with the 49ers last year, got to sit on the bench and just learn. And now he's, with a better quarterback coach. So, now he's kind of turning it around. Is he going to have a terrific career from here on out? I don't know. But he looks like he's back on the right track, taking advantage of a lot of physical ability. And he's got Justin Jefferson and some other guys next to him who make the job a whole lot easier, right? But most guys don't get that. They don't even get that opportunity for it. So most guys end up failing. And we end up back in this conversation of like, how are we going to be better at it? And like, there's science that people are trying to put into it. They're trying to measure, people's reaction times. They're trying to measure, you know, how do they process information. But even then, you can measure somebody's processing time, but until you find out how they react after they've gotten hit by a 300-pound man who's trying to drive them into the turf, and then have that happen, a bunch more times, and see how they get up and react from it, and how they handle being in the situation or handle having money, gobs of money for the first time in their life. Until you get there, you just don't know how they're going to react. That's as simple as it gets, and that's the hardest part of figuring out whether people can do that. Look, HR, human resources in any company, um, is fraught with failure. Even the best hiring managers at places like Hewlett Packard or NVIDIA or wherever get their decisions wrong. And we're not even talking about having physical tools. We're just talking about hiring people whether they're qualified.
Right. One last question on the whole quarterback thing. Drake May, you reminded me because you brought up Darnold and sitting for a year and learning. What do you think the Patriots should have done with Drake May? Because it seems like it's always a debate. Should the rookie quarterback sit, learn for a year, take it all in, or do you throw him into the flames and hopefully he learns through experience?
There's no one size fits all in this one. I hate to
Golden
say
question.
that. Right. It's where is your team and what does it look like? What kind of protection do you have for a guy? What do you have ready? Do you have tools for him to succeed? Does is he mentally ready? Did he play in a system that translates to playing in professional sports? All of those things go into the consideration. Carson Palmer sat for a year, had a very good career. Um, Other guys, Ben Roethlisberger, thrown into the fire. Had a great career. Patrick Mahomes sat for a year. He's maybe the best of all time. Tom Brady sat for a year. He's maybe the GOAT. Peyton Manning played right away. Set a rookie record for the most interceptions. Learned a lot really fast. There is no single answer. Um, I will say this: when you draft a quarterback, though, when you have a franchise quarterback, don't be afraid to keep surrounding him with tools that make it easier for him to play. Peyton Manning, walked into the Indianapolis Colts and they already had Marvin Harrison. Well, what did they do? They went out and got a couple of different tight ends. They drafted Reggie Wayne, and then they got Edgerrin James. Because guess what? You get guys who are really talented to go with a quarterback who's really talented. Make the game simpler for a great quarterback.
Yeah, that is good advice. We'll get back to quarterbacks. So we have a little thing at the end. You obviously have a say in the Hall of Fame. So I have a little fun exercise here at the end. So we'll get back to some quarterback talk. But back to Elway. So
Mm-hmm.
Elway's a high school phenom. We talked about the stars aligning and him going to school in Southern California where they threw the ball 30, 40 times a game. For those who are not familiar with Elway's high school highlights, I implore you to go to YouTube and look them up because they are like something out of a movie. I felt like I was watching, a
It's a
sports
bit of a
movie.
video, it is a bit of a video game where you feel like you're watching like, and this dates me the movie Flubber where like they create a ball that bounces and goes a million miles, right? Like
Right.
how does he throw a ball 80 yards like that? Out of his own end zone. I mean, it really is pretty amazing stuff.
He's like scrambling backwards, barely sets his feet, and just chucks it, 70, 80 yards to a guy in the corner of the end zone. I mean, I like you said, it's like something out of a video game. It's a perfect way to describe it. So Elway wraps up his high school career. But one thing I didn't know was that baseball was a very prominent sport in his life, along with football. And for the longest time, there, was some controversy as to which sport Elway would ultimately pick. So what was kind of the role of baseball in Elway's football career?
Well, I mean, you're talking about the guy who was an LA City Player of the Year when he was a junior in high school. So he's the player of the year in baseball in one of the most competitive baseball environments in the country at the time. So he's a super phenomenal talent. If not for football, he's probably a first round pick in baseball. And there would have been a line of teams wanting to go after him, right? He's that good a hitter. He's a left handed hitter, power hitter, guy with a cannon arm in baseball. Got recruited to play at Stanford. So, I mean, he would have been a first round draft pick if he had out of high school if he had told the scouts, "Yeah, I'll try and play baseball." As it was, he ended up being a second round pick after his junior year in college. In baseball, and when the Yankees took him, because George Steinbrenner loved two-way athletes, uh, so he wanted to take a shot with him, signed him and got him to play minor league baseball for 1 year and only on to New York. I think that was single A ball or maybe it's low A. I can't remember what it was. Um, he ended up being the most effective hitter on that team. And most importantly, it gave him leverage, which was critical for when it was time to go through the NFL draft process, because that ultimately forced the hands of the people who drafted him initially to send him to Denver. So baseball plays a critical role. I don't know that he had the passion to play the minor leagues where you have to sit on a bus and go through that process. Then again, he might have been a great baseball player uh, if he had never been a quarterback. I mean, if he had just concentrated on baseball full time, um, he might have ended up being an all-star. There are people who believe he would have been an all-star. Now there are people who also think he wouldn't have been able to hit major league pitching. But the scouting process, as rough as the scouting process is in football, it's even, I would say, even rougher when you start dealing with guys and whether they can hit in baseball.
So we get to Elway's college career. We've mentioned it. He ultimately goes to Stanford, but I can't help but bring up something that happens with Missouri and some cheerleaders from Missouri. If probably, honestly, Jason, I have a lot of favorite moments from the book. That is probably top three for me in the entire book, just because it caught me off guard so much.
Yes, yeah, the Missouri cheerleaders were fairly forward. I'm at the moment drawing a blank on exactly what the phrase was that they said. Um, Something like "We'll keep you warm" or something like that. Um, yeah, but they were, yeah, the Missouri cheerleaders, because Mike Price was coaching that there at the time, and Mike Price had a relationship with the Elway family that dates back to when they were all in, Washington and Montana and that Northwest area before. But Mike Price had made it a priority to make sure that they get Elway, so he sent a lot. He had the cheerleaders send some, what let's just say, enticing postcards and letters to Elway. I wouldn't call them exactly X-rated, but it was fairly clear that where this was going to go if he had ended up in Missouri. So
Yeah, I
it's
I
good.
have
It's good
your
to be the king sometimes.
yeah, I have the exact quote here. So it says, "We don't go to bed with teddy bears. We only sleep with Missouri tigers."
Yep. Yeah, that's yeah. They didn't leave a lot to they did not leave a lot to the imagination. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, that's a good
So
way to put it.
yeah, so it's an interesting recruitment. His mother saw that, and I think she called Mike Price and read him the riot act. After that one, she wasn't pleased. Well, she wasn't pleased with those tactics. Ultimately, he wanted to stay on the West Coast. He wanted to be near his folks. Um, so Stanford is Stanford. So you have a chance to get a great career. That was something that Jack always told him, look, I don't want anybody to be anthropologists. I want people to have real degrees and get jobs. So his dad sold him on the idea as well, like that if you have a chance to go to a place like Stanford, you take it. Even though Jack regretted it since he ended up coaching at San Jose State and wished he had recruited his own kid, but I think he knew, like he didn't have the offer. He didn't have the goods at San Jose State that Stanford had in terms of the value of the degree.
Yeah, and you summarized Elway's college career as a roller coaster that ended in chaos. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's really up and down. So the guy that recruits him, which is, well, who really recruited him was Bill Walsh and an assistant coach named Rod Dowhower. But Bill Walsh leaves Stanford to go to the 49ers just before Elway gets there. They knew that was happening. They knew that was going to occur. Dowhower, which was one of his assistants, was supposed to stay and continue to run the same offense, which is a very quarterback friendly offense. Um, and then after that year, that gets shut down, and they bring in Paul Wiggin because Dowhower gets fired because he doesn't get along with the athletic director. And so you have this hope that the team's going to be great because they're coming off of two bowl games before he gets there. They actually got invited to a bowl game during Elway's freshman year, but they turned down the invitation because they didn't think they were good enough for whatever reason. And the next 3 years are spent with an incredible amount of expectation. They were ranked very highly in a couple of those years. Sports Illustrated put them in the top 10, I believe, because they had Elway. They never really had the great depth of talent to make it work. Um, but there's this expectation, and it never really gets fulfilled. But there are these amazing moments, like They beat Oklahoma in Oklahoma during his sophomore year. I remember being a freshman and we were listening to it, and he's just going through Oklahoma. They beat number one Washington at Stanford. They give USC and UCLA all they can handle in a couple of games. There are some amazing games in there where they beat ranked opponents, but there is never a season that holds up, to those kinds of performances. There's an opener at Ohio State where they upset Ohio State when Elway throws a touchdown pass at the end of the game. There are just some really high highs, but there is never a complete season, and there is never a bowl appearance, and then all of it ends. And I was there, but all of it ends with the single most memorable play in the history of college football, which is the play in which the Stanford band ends up on the field and the University of California ends up returning the ball. And I'm still bitter to this day, and I didn't even play in that game. But it was truly chaos, and it was Elway leading one of the great last second drives of all time, getting the go ahead field goal with 4 seconds left in the game. Stanford having a kickoff, and then all hell breaks loose when hundreds of people end up on the field, and Cal, has laterals the ball 5 times. They go through the band, they score the touchdown, and everybody is from the Stanford side is pissed off out of their minds because it's the biggest miracle, and it will never happen again. Like it just can't, because between the technology of review that you have and the ability to replay plays, and the monitoring and officiating that goes with it, the much more sophisticated level of officiating, that play never that it just doesn't happen. It just can't happen again. So it's a perfect storm of the most memorable play in college football happening, and that being sort of the chef's kiss to a just brutal college career for Elway. And that's how he ends his career, in this just horrendous emotional game where he was a hero right up until the last 4 seconds.
Well, can you imagine if that play happened now in the age of social media? And I don't know if you saw the clip from yesterday's Washington Chicago game with Stevenson, I think he's a
Yeah.
safety for the Bears, basically taunting the fans before the Hail Mary, and the amount of backlash that he received for that. Imagine a play like that happening in the age of Twitter and TikTok and Instagram and all this stuff.
No,
And
it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't. And the other side of it is, like, they just don't, let kids on the field that way. Like they hold everybody back. It it does not it does not happen ever again. You will never ever see anything like that. You'll say some crazy plays. Don't get me wrong. The Iron Bowl between Auburn and Alabama has that historic kickoff return, which is an amazing play. Don't get me wrong. But they didn't have the band on the field. They didn't have hundreds of other fans on the field. Like it wasn't going on. Um, and it didn't have 5 laterals, and it didn't have a trombone player at the end getting knocked over. It was truly, truly nuts. And rarely would it have all of that preceded by the game, what was perceived to be the game-winning drive, um, in advance of that, where we should have never called timeout with 8 seconds left. Like, no, nobody ever makes that mistake either. Like, nobody makes the mistake of calling the timeout too early and ending up having to kick off. They all call the timeout with like 3 seconds left, so that the field goal attempt is the last play of the game. We screwed it up. And I always say this, like Stanford, which is a math and engineering school primarily, didn't know how to handle the math of the clock at the end of the game. Like, we screwed that up. So, I mean, again, that never happens. And Elway, leaves that game basically in tears and frustration and anger, because he's done everything that he possibly can, not only to win the game, but they were supposed to go to the Peach Bowl if they won the game, and it didn't happen.
Well, and I think he finishes second in Heisman voting that year as
to
well.
Herschel Walker. Yeah. And, the late season push, a couple of late season games really cost him. And I think that final game really put it out of reach for him where Herschel Walker beats him. And, look, Herschel Walker is tremendous college player. And had a good pro career as well. Don't get me wrong, but Herschel Walker wasn't John Elway. Don't kid yourself.
Well, Jason, if it makes you feel any better, I watch Sunday every weekend, or I watch the NFL every weekend, and I mean, seemingly at least once or twice during the weekend, I see coaches mess up time management, either the last 2 minutes of a half or the last 2 minutes of a game. I'm convinced that if these coaches played a little more Madden, we might actually get somewhere. So, but
And yeah, I will also say this: the story is I'm standing in the stands, and we're at Cal for that game, right? And standing in the stands with my buddy. Yeah, it was about 10 of us actually in the stands, and we're just watching the game. And as I'm standing there, this guy named Paul Heidenreich, one of my roommates in college, right? He turns and he goes, "We're going to have to kick off." So this wasn't really complicated stuff. Like it was not like this is essential kind of stuff. Like you just run the clock down so that the field goal is the last thing you do. This, I mean, it was, and I know that the Stanford coaches, the assistant coaches up in the press box were furious with each other, because the guy who decided to make the call for the timeout was, like they didn't talk to each other and they didn't plan it out. So yeah, I get time management and guys not knowing how to run the clock, especially in the last 2 minutes, or when do you start using your timeouts outside of the 2 minute warning and things like that. Not a lot of them study it. I get it, but this was as basic as it could possibly be.
I can tell it still hurts to this day.
Oh, you just have no idea. You have no idea. You have no idea what it was like to be at that game, and then like after the game to have to walk through. My buddy had a former girlfriend who she was in one. I think she was a Delta in the sororities at Cal, and he promised her that we were going to go after the game and see her. And I'm like, can you imagine walking through the fraternity and sorority row at Cal after that game, like, and you're in your
Torture.
Stanford sweatshirt and people are just mocking you left and right. And we walked there, and I'm like, Dave, can we just go home? Like, you can call her, man. Like, call her and tell her, like, it was a bad day. Like the guys just didn't want to do this. Can we just do that? But we walked over there, whatever. And, like, I don't even think he was getting any. So, whatever.
So for the sake of your sanity, let's move
Yeah.
on to the 1983 NFL draft. Um so a lot of storylines in this draft and a lot of moving pieces and there's a lot happening. You do a fantastic job of breaking it down in the book. For the audience here, can you just give us kind of the state of the NFL during that draft? There's some stuff with the commissioner, with the USFL, led by a guy who might be prominent nowadays. So there's a lot of underlying storylines that are even beyond the whole, what team is drafting who where. So maybe let's start with some of those storylines and we'll get into how the draft actually plays out.
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, there's like this competition between baseball and football. People don't understand football still hadn't quite cemented itself as the number one sport in America. Baseball was still up there. And there's definitely a competition going on between the two sports. So Pete Rozelle, who was the commissioner at the time, has a meeting with Elway's agent as Elway is trying to leverage baseball against football. And Rozelle, first of all, wants to get him away from baseball and says, I want him in this sport. The second part of it is there's this upstart league, which is the USFL, which at the time Donald Trump was just getting involved with as an owner of the New Jersey Generals. But they had some people who wanted to make a splash, and Herschel Walker, signed with the USFL to go play for Trump eventually. Um, So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of competition for players. Jim Kelly, who got drafted by Buffalo, went and played in the USFL. They were trying to get players. That's definitely true. Um, and so Roselle is concerned about all of that. Okay, they're also coming off of a player strike in 1982. So there's the NFL is kind of wounded because people, the networks and the fans are sitting here going, you missed basically half the season last year. What's going on here? So they're trying to solve that. Um, there's just a lot up in the air, and all of a sudden, in the middle of all that chaos, that sort of turmoil about competition between sports and who's paying what, you get the guy who's considered the greatest quarterback ever, or the greatest prospect at quarterback ever, who's part of a group of quarterbacks, of six guys who ended up going in the first round. This bevy of guys at a time when the game is changing and going to be more influenced by quarterbacks than ever before because of the way the rules change. You get the number one prospect, and like half the NFL is interested. Now it comes down to 5 or 6 teams that have the wherewithal to do it. But John Elway was so good that Bill Walsh, who was coaching the 49ers and had already won a Super Bowl with Joe Montana, thought about making the trade to go get Elway and get rid of Montana. That's how good he was. It was so good that the San Diego Chargers thought about that they were going to make a trade for Elway, even though they had Dan Fouts, an eventual Hall of Fame quarterback, playing for them. You know, you know, the Raiders push all in to try and make this trade happen. And the one place that Pete Rozelle won't let John Elway play is the Raiders. And so the NFL gets in the way of it. So there's a lineup of teams that were interested in making the deal for Elway, but it just never happens. They all get spooked by something. Something gets in the way of doing it. But the Baltimore Colts end up taking him, and the Baltimore Colts were complete chaos at that time. They had an owner in Bob Irsay who interfered all the time, was not terribly good at managing a team, was a bit of a drunk himself, who was also at war with the city of Baltimore. Famously, they moved a year later from Baltimore to Indianapolis. So there's everything going on here. Elway gets drafted by Baltimore. Elway publicly kind of throws a hissy fit and says, "I'll never play for them," because he has told them before the draft, "I don't want to play for Baltimore. Trade my rights." They end up drafting him anyways, and it takes days until after the draft for a deal to finally be worked out between Denver and Baltimore. And the backstory, which you read, of the relationship between Edgar Kaiser, the owner of the Broncos at the time, and Bob Irsay, was a happenstance relationship that Kaiser was able to wait out and finally work a deal to get Elway and make it all unfold and all come together. And it's a bit of a minor miracle that he ends up in Denver in what ends up being a steal of a trade. Uh, you know, the Baltimore Colts ended up with a guy named Chris Hinton, had a terrific career. They ended up with a couple of other players who were okay. They didn't end up with anything close to what Elway was, but it is a circus atmosphere for a good, if you count all the months leading up to the draft, it's probably 3 months of a complete circus before Elway ends up in Denver in one of the greatest trades in NFL history.
Do you think that I guess we'll stick specifically to quarterbacks. Do you think that quarterbacks still possess that amount of power? I mean, I've heard it in the past with other quarterbacks where they say, "Oh, I don't want to play for the Bears or whatever," but I've never really seen it play out to the point where quarterbacks
Well,
still have the amount of
Eli
power that
Manning,
Elway had in the '83 draft.
Eli Manning, Eli Manning,
That's fair.
yeah, didn't refuse to play. Kelly Stouffer, who people don't really remember because he didn't have a great career, but he refused to play for I think it was the St. Louis Cardinals, either the St. Louis Cardinals or the Arizona Cardinals. I can't remember exactly where they were at the moment. So guys have done it. Even Bo Jackson. Bo Jackson, not even a quarterback, um, successfully said, "I'm not playing for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers." Players have more power than they're sometimes willing to exert because they're not willing to take the negativity and the negative press that goes with exerting that power. But yeah, they have that power. You can call your shot and say, "I'm not playing for you," if you're really willing to go the distance, and you'll get what you want eventually. But you have to put up with the fact that the fans are going to hate you. And for a long time, fans hated John Elway, and Terry Bradshaw stirred a lot of that hatred with the way that he talked about Elway before the draft. Said, you don't want to leave California, you don't want to leave the West Coast. Well, why don't you just play baseball? He mocked him basically. Um, but yeah, I still think that quarterbacks hold that kind of power. Like if Caleb Williams didn't want to play for Chicago this year, um, he probably could have gotten out of it. Joe Burrow, if he didn't want to go to Cincinnati, he could have gotten out of it. But you have to be willing to tolerate the crap that goes with it.
Really quick, I want to go back to Elway's greatness. And you mentioned it in terms of the prospect that he was, but you had a quote in here from an NFL exec, Bill Polian, who said that every quarterback is a version of either Andrew Luck or John Elway, depending on what era you look at. What can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, it's always about, do you have the size? Do you have the intelligence? I mean, do you have the accuracy? Do you have the decision making to go with it? Are you a big man who can handle, the physical nature of playing the position? Can you move and run well enough to create? Do you have, all the qualities that you measure, and you can prioritize them in different ways? And again, I come back to the number one and number two are your decision making and your accuracy, but those are not alone. There's arm strength, there's running ability, there's size, there's all these things. There are leaderships, and it's all sorts of intangible things. And when you look at it, yeah, John Elway is the prototype, and Andrew Luck was the next version of that prototype, and then he got hurt, and didn't want to deal with the pain anymore. So yeah, that's what Polian's talking about. That's what you want to have. When you draw it up, that's what you want to look at. So even, as much as like a Jaden Daniels this year is having a fantastic year, when you look at Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams the same way, they're small dudes. You can't get around that. Now they're talented, and you're going to take them and you're going to work with them. But like, you better protect their ass, or they ain't going to be playing very long. If you let those guys get hit too much, it's going to be a short career. That's just the way that it works out. So you want to have the sturdy guy who can move around and create. And again, the game is primarily played from the pocket. The geometry, the math that goes with playing football and being a quarterback still depends on being in the middle of the field most of the time so that you can deliver throws all over the field and not just to one side or the other. Right? And people don't really understand that part of it. And that's what goes into making a guy being a prototype. And that's why Elway is the prototype. I think what Polian called him the statue of David of quarterbacks. He's the representation of what man is supposed to look like, or in this case, quarterback is supposed to look like.
Well, and to your point about Jane Daniels, I mean, we've already seen him, get hurt this year. Thankfully, he was able to play against the Bears this past weekend. But it is kind of the nature of the situation. To your point, they're smaller dudes and they like to scramble, and that's when things can sometimes get dangerous. I mean, we saw it with bigger dudes too, even with Cam, right? Like, I mean, once you get out of the pocket, you're opening up yourself to a whole world of possibilities that
Well,
could not end well for you.
there's running, there's being able to run, and then there's running a lot. And
Right.
most quarterbacks just don't last. I mean, I always worry about that with Lamar Jackson. Now, Lamar has been successful in not taking a lot of hits, but he's taken some. And basically, the rule of thumb was you can't have too many more than a couple of years where you carry the ball 100 times if you're a quarterback. Because if you start doing that, you're going to get your body banged up. Cam Newton is an example of a guy who shortened his career because he took a lot of hits. Talented dude, you know, another guy who, if you're drawing it up physically, that's what it's supposed to look like. Didn't necessarily have all the arm talent or the decision making of some of these other guys, but certainly had a very successful career. Um, Not quite great, but very good career, and certainly was worth that number one overall pick. Um, but probably didn't achieve everything that everybody ever wanted from him because he didn't play the position in the way that you would call a prototype style.
Right. So, getting back to Elway, he gets drafted by the Colts. He gets traded to the Broncos. And then when we look at Elway's career and the way that you lay it out in the book, I think of Elway's career in basically three main parts. There is the triple Super Bowl loss in 86, 87, and 89, which is one phase of his career. And then you have kind of this like middle down period where there's a head coaching change, there's some turmoil, and then you have the Mike Shanahan era.
Yep.
And so I was hoping in those three phases, if you could kind of give the audience what your main takeaway is from those three parts of Elway's career. It's also worth mentioning that Elway did not get off to the fastest start his rookie year.
Well, it was terrible his rookie year, statistically. Game was very different, playing a complex offense, not surrounded by great talent. Good coach. Dan Reeves is a good coach, not a great one. Um, I would say that the the greatest way to sort of summarize it is Elway was coached by a control freak who wanted to do things his way at first, that being Dan Reeves. Dan Reeves was, thought he kind of thought he was the smartest guy in the room and took control of things and didn't have the flexibility to see how do I take advantage of this quarterback and you know and didn't know how to help the quarterback become better as a position. And he's always coached by kind of a laissez-faire guy, and Wade Phillips is like, okay, we'll just you guys do whatever you need to do, make it work. And that's a real short-term kind of band-aid um, era, and the team is starting to fall apart. And then you get Mike Shanahan, who's a control freak himself, but a control freak who understood the value of the quarterback and that you have to help the quarterback. And you have to make the job easier for the quarterback so that you're not stressing him out all the time, and that you're asking him to save you when you absolutely need it. Um, and And Mike Shanahan created one of the greatest offensive teams of all time for a 3-year stretch of time with, Terrell Davis, great running back, a system that worked perfectly for Terrell Davis in the running game, and receivers who were good enough, along with a Hall of Fame tight end, um, put it all together in a perfect way. And that is statistically, if you look at Elway's career, he's one of the few athletes who's ever had the best statistical seasons of his career over his final 3 years compared to his first 14 or for first 13, I should say. That's really hard to do. It's really hard to end your career at the statistical height, but it speaks not to his ability, it speaks to what was built around him. And that's why I always say, look back at those coaches, back at what they did, and look at their perspective on how the quarterback position was supposed to be run.
In another moment where the stars seemingly aligned for Elway, there was a moment in time when the Broncos were looking for a new head coach, and seemingly everyone thought that Mike Shanahan would be the next man up as offensive coordinator for the Broncos. Shanahan decided to not take the Broncos job
Mhm.
and to go coach the 49ers, which at the time was devastating for, Broncos fans and I'm sure Elway. But it ended up actually probably being the best thing that could have ever happened. Why is that?
Well, because Shanahan got to learn the 49er system and the way that they did business. And so that when he came back, he could say, here is the system we're going to install, and here's the way that we're going to run the organization. Pat Bowlen was the owner, for most of the time when Elway was there under Reeves and also under Wade Phillips. But Pat Bowlen, was not a lifer in football who understood how do you install a system and an infrastructure for how you're going to win. He needed Shanahan to come back with this is how you install the infrastructure and the system for how we're going to win. And look, it's really hard. It's like as people like to, uh, not people. One particular person in my life once said, his name was Brian Wiedmeyer. He was a great executive who worked for Cleveland and for Miami. He once told me, he goes, NFL teams do not come with an owner's manual. So there's nothing that says this is how you're supposed to do it. Okay. And so people learn the hard way, and owners go through a lot of hardship, especially when they think they know football and they really don't. The one thing about Pat Bowlen is he knew enough to know what he didn't know, and he let Mike Shanahan come back and put the system together the way that it needed to be put together. And that sets everything in motion for them to have their greatest, run in the history of their organization.
Really, I was just setting you up so that you could talk up the 49ers and how great those teams in the 90s were.
80s and 90s. Eddie
Yeah.
DeBartolo, another great example. He had Bill Walsh, and he had a brilliant guy who understood organization and demands, and let him install everything, and that became the way they did business for probably the better part of 15 years, which is why they won 5 Super Bowls, right? So yeah, and then you know Shanahan is part of that last Super Bowl victory in that run. So yeah, he learned from that system. Even if Walsh wasn't there when he was there, he learned what the Walsh system is. And I would say the Walsh system is the most important one in the history of football. After not after it's the most important system in the history of football. With Paul Brown's teaching being really important prior to that, but Walsh understood how to set up the game around the quarterback and how to help the quarterback from a strategic standpoint and from a personnel standpoint and how the organization should be run. And then he had an owner who bought into it, and so you had sort of Camelot for football at that point. So it was really fun to be a 49ers fan at that time. I didn't grow up a 49ers fan, but I've come to appreciate their greatness all these years later. Even though I was a Rams fan growing up and I hated the 49ers for a long time, I appreciate their greatness.
As a resident 49ers fan, I have to ask, from covering football, do you, besides maybe the system, do you see any similarities between Mike and Kyle Shanahan?
Um, yeah, look, they're both demanding, they're both driven, they're both over the top, sort of maniacs in their own way. I don't know that Kyle is the master manipulator that his father was. Um, but that doesn't mean that he's not a great coach. I think that Kyle is a great coach, and that he has not been fortunate. So, look, he's undone himself a couple of times. So, don't get me wrong. They should have won a Super Bowl in Atlanta if he hadn't been so stubborn. Um, but the 49ers, this version of the 49ers has accomplished about as much as you could ever possibly hope for with what they've done. short of, they haven't won a Super Bowl and they've been close, twice, really, really close twice. But they lost, they just lost to a better team in both times, and they lost to a better quarterback. And in both cases, um, the best quarterback on the field was Patrick Mahomes that day. And generally, the quarterback is going to come up with a couple of plays. They upgraded the second time to Brock Purdy, but they still made the critical mistakes in the game. Muffing a punt, missing a block, missing a block on a protection. Those are the things that could have turned the game. There was probably 3 or 4 plays in that game that, if you just turn one of them, you probably win the game. But when you don't, and Mahomes is on the other side, you're going to get crushed.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely don't remind me because I've still yet to watch the highlights of the most recent Super Bowl. I probably the worst loss I've had to endure as a sports fan. Brutal, especially considering, I thought we would have learned from the first time that we were up 10 against the Chiefs, in 2019. I really thought that we would come out, run the ball more, but to your point, Shanahan gets stubborn sometimes, man, and I've seen it this year, and I don't want to turn this into a Shanahan podcast, but the 10-point leads that we've blown, he just gets in this mindset of whatever his game plan is before the game, he seemingly wants to stick with that, and I don't know.
I look, I get that. I hear that criticism. I say you can't blow special teams plays and you can't give up big plays. Um, the players cost them those games. There are physical errors that were made in those losses. Now the Minnesota game, they got beat legitimately by Minnesota, no question about it. Arizona, they beat themselves. Um, what are the other losses I'm trying to think of? The Arizona game. I mean, they
Rams.
have hurt the Ram. Oh my God, the Rams game. Like the blown coverage on Tutu Atwell in that game. I mean, they just some stupid stuff. And then the I think that Atwell gets the punt return in that game as well, or the young return. I can't remember which one it was. But they had 2 bad plays in that game too. And those are you can blame Kyle Shanahan all you want. When you blow plays like that in the fourth quarter, you deserve to lose. That's just the way it is. And the players have to take responsibility for that one. I don't put that as much on Kyle. Now, I will say that the game against Minnesota, they got out coached. I mean, they definitely Kyle did not have answers for what Minnesota was doing defensively. Great game plan defensively. Um, didn't work out. So that one's a legit loss. But a couple others, no, those were on the players.
Yeah. I just love blaming Shanahan. It's probably
Everybody does. It's easiest guy to blame the coach.
right. Yeah.
And it's like I remember having a conversation with somebody. They were talking about Trey Lance, and obviously he screwed up the Trey Lance pick. There's no question about it. And somebody was screaming at me, you know, he should face consequences for that. And I was like listening to him. I go, okay, you had a bad pick. You traded the guy away. What do you want to do now? Like, what's the consequences? Like, are you going to fire Kyle Shanahan? That seems like a really stupid idea. Like that's just not smart. And they're like, wow. Like, so what's the consequence that you want to pay? I mean, you want to complain about Shanahan. I mean, do you want to go back to Chip Kelly? Do you really want to do that? Do you want to go back to who is the guy
Jim
after?
Tom Sula.
Do you want to go back to Tom Sula? You remember how that turned out? You want to go back to Dennis Erickson? You want to go back to Mariucci? Do you want to do that? Like Harbaugh was really great. Walsh is the greatest of all of them. And then you come after that, it's pretty much Shanahan. And we can argue Harbaugh versus Shanahan. Who is better? I'd rather have Shanahan, but um, again, you want Chip Kelly or Tom Sula? Start firing coaches. Go ahead, see how it turns out.
Well, and this is the last thing I'll say because, like, again, I don't want to turn this into a 49ers podcast, but I will say the 49ers is a fan base, and I've seen this. Twitter's the worst for this because it just amplifies, the worst messaging. But there, we have been blessed these past 5 years, during this run, and I think a lot of people forget, to your point, the dark times, the times when we were bottom of the barrel, and again, it's easy, to use the coach as the scapegoat and to say, Shanahan didn't have a good game plan. But to your point, a lot of times it's on the players and it's on the execution. And listen, Brock Purdy, I've been the first to say another thing that annoys me is like the fan base always protect Purdy and blame Shanahan. I'm like, listen, Purdy has bad games. Like he's had a couple of bad games this year. Like that game against the Chiefs last week was bad. That was a bad Purdy game.
Yeah,
And
I mean it's a bad Purdy game, and then when you're down your top three receivers, it's
yeah,
sometimes sometimes you just can't overcome circumstances, and that's just the way it is. And it's too you want to think, okay, next man up, it's going to work. Like he's dealing with Cowling and Pearsall. Those guys never played in an NFL game. Basically,
right.
you want them to walk in for Debo and Ayuk. I mean, and Jennings, guys he knows how to communicate with. It was a bad game. Yeah, he threw some horrible passes. I don't think he knew where. I don't think that Purdy, when he stepped back there to throw, really trusted. I know where my guys are going to be. He just didn't because he hasn't worked with those guys. So sometimes you're just going to have games like that, and sometimes, despite your best efforts and best thoughts, you can draw up the greatest game plans in the world. It ain't going to work. That was one of those days. Now I can say the the Vikings game, you could probably redraw that game and find a way to win it. The Rams game and the Arizona game, no question. You can find ways to win that game, which are simple. Execute the plays. The Chiefs game, that's probably a game, no matter what you do, no matter how you draw it up, you probably never win that game.
Yep. Agreed. So Jason, going back to Elway, to kind of wrap up Elway's playing career. So he loses those three Super Bowls in 86, 87, 89. He finally gets the monkey off his back in 97, beating the Packers. And if you want to look up a really cool play, just look up the helicopter Elway. I think someone described it as the greatest 8-yard run in the history of the NFL.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a fun play and everything that goes into it. I mean, it's
yeah.
described in great detail in the book. And John talked about it a lot, but everything that went into that play, it made it so unexpected. And him questioning himself throughout the week about what goes into that helicopter play that really turns the whole game emotionally. Um, and the kind of momentum that went with that play and everything that was on the line. So yeah, that's an amazing run. It's a play you see all the time. I mean, when they do hype videos for the Super Bowl, that's on one of the top 5 to 10 plays that they always go back to talk about, the greatness of the game. Whether it's the Umichi run, whether it's the throw to Dwight Clark, whether it's the immaculate reception, the Elway helicopter run is right up there as one of those plays that defines the greatness of the game and the excitement of the game and everything that goes into it. Um, and it's a triumphant moment for a guy who was drafted as one of the greatest throwers of all time. Everybody thinks about that, but really was a terrific runner and a great all-around player who didn't have a great Super Bowl that day. Statistically, it's not a great game, but found a way to win the game and contribute at critical moments. He made a couple of plays in that game that turned it around. The throw to McCaffrey, that was earlier in that drive, that run, and his willingness to be selfless essentially and say, "Look, all these years." All these times, I want to be the star as we upset this. That wasn't his mentality. It was just win the game. And if I have to hand the ball to Terrell Davis 50 times, I'm going to hand the ball to Terrell Davis 50 times so we can win this game. Not every player is like that. I will say that. But he did it. and he ends his career on a high note with that Super Bowl. Comes back and wins the next one. Again, last 3 seasons of his career, I think they win 38 games total in the regular season. They won 2 championships. They might have won 3 if not for the upset loss to Jacksonville in the '96 playoffs. But just a spectacular run to end his career. Um, and a testimony to patience and endurance um, and getting through it, competition. Um, kind of a fun story about a guy who was both talented, um, but also showed off the perseverance to take advantage of that talent, despite not getting a chance to take advantage of it earlier in his career.
Retires in 1999. When you look back on Elway's career, just from a pure football perspective, what do you think his impact was on the game and continues to be?
I think he's one of those 3 or 4 guys who defines the era of the quarter when the quarterback takes over the NFL. Look, the quarterback's always been important. Don't get me wrong. That the '71 draft where you open with 3 quarterbacks going with Plunkett, Pastorini, and Manning, Archie Manning. The importance of Johnny Unitas, the importance of Joe Namath. There's the Sammy Baugh, Otto Graham. There's been great quarterbacks all the time, but in the '70s, they intentionally changed the game to help the quarterback, to promote the passing game, to make the game more entertaining. You needed guys to then step up into that role. And where the game was really defined in its sort of first, you know, 50 years, 55 years by by coaches, like these sideline generals, the Landrys, the Knowles, the Shulas, the Paul Browns, the Lombardis of the world, right? Those were the guys who were the faces of the game. That face of the game becomes quarterbacks in the '80s and has maintained that for 40 plus years now. We look at quarterbacks as the heroes much more than we did previously. Again, it used to be coaches, now it's quarterbacks. And yes, there are some great coaches, Andy Reid, Belichick, and others, but the face of the game is about players. The way we look at it is about players. And the players we look at the most are Aaron Rodgers, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady. Those are the guys who have the biggest impact on the game. And that table is set during that early '80s era with Montana, Elway, Marino, to a lesser extent, Jim Kelly. They carry the era going forward. And so Elway is one of those guys who is the face of football as it changes to a quarterback age.
Speaking of quarterbacks, once Elway is done with his playing career, he
Mhm.
transitions into becoming the head of football operations for the Broncos in 2011. And again, plenty of details. I highly recommend that you go pick up the book to actually understand the full picture. But my main 2 points that I want to hit on for Elway as an exec was how he handled Tebow and essentially stepping into Tebow mania at kind of the beginning of his tenure. And then towards the end of his tenure, he ends up with Manning. So it's like these two dichotomies, if you will,
Yeah.
at both the beginning and end of his kind of tenure as an executive. Ultimately ends well for Elway, winning the Super Bowl, obviously in 2015 with the Broncos. But if you could just go into a little more detail on Tebow and then how the whole Manning thing went down.
Well, Tebow is Tebow's tough because, and I lived in Florida in Gainesville, Florida, specifically when he was quarterback at the University of Florida. And he's just one of those characters that, so many people are drawn to because they think that he confirms, the belief in themselves and their faith. Um, and they believe that he's going to make it, and that God is sort of given him this place that he's going to be successful no matter what, even though he functionally has a hard time playing the professional game. He's great in college. He's a fantastic player in the system that he was playing in. When you put him in the NFL, he can't function on a regular basis. And look, I know they went 8-8, and made the playoffs, that year, and a lot of magic happened. Um, it wasn't going to last. It never was going to last. And he got plenty of opportunities to try and prove it in other places, New England, Philadelphia, the Jets. It just never panned out because he just can't do that job. He's not designed for it. But people believed he was, because he represented something that was important in their lives because of his faith. Um, and so it was a PR nightmare for Elway and the Broncos. It's not just we're going to move on because we don't believe it. It became a referendum on religion. And if you didn't think that Tebow was going to make it, that meant you were against people's faith. And that was really, really tough to deal with. Okay. It was really brutal to deal with. And the only way you were ever going to get out of that is you better get Peyton Manning. You better get a guy that nobody can argue with, that this guy's got a track record, that you prove it. And then you better help Peyton Manning out. Just like I said, you got to help quarterbacks out and support them. You better get players around that guy. You have Demaryius Thomas, all right, that's great. Go out and get an Eric Decker, then go get a Sanders, then go get running backs, then get offensive linemen, build a defense that takes pressure off of him with a Von Miller, and all the DBs that they had, Chris Harris and Aqib Talib, and getting DeMarcus Ware on the other side, all the different moves that they made to build that team. And when it falls apart the first time, in Seattle, crushes you one time, don't back down. Come back and figure out how are we gonna put this thing back together so we can take another advantage of that. It was just a really, really delicate operation. But I think very few people have an understanding of just how hard it was to move on from Tim Tebow, to sit there and convince Peyton Manning. I mean, it wasn't hard to convince Peyton Manning, but you had to handle it the right way. You couldn't beg Peyton Manning. And I hear a lot of people say, Elway got Peyton Manning, it was easy. He was never able to pick a quarterback. What people do not understand is the sales job that Elway did with Peyton Manning, to basically say to Peyton and give him an assurance. And even Peyton and Elway don't always see eye to eye, didn't see eye to eye. But in that moment when they were recruiting him, Peyton Manning could look at another guy and say, "You've been in my shoes. You know what it takes, to be great. You know what it takes to win. Can I trust you that you're going to build around me?" And Elway, essentially, without words, could look back at him and say, "I get it. I understand." And that was the tipping point to get Manning to come to Denver. And without Elway, I don't think Manning comes to Denver. I don't think it happens. I don't think you get the 2 Super Bowl appearances, let alone the 1 title. And you don't get that. And for all the people who want to complain about Elway and his inability to pick a quarterback after that, 1 Super Bowl victory in 10 years is a pretty good deal. You should be pretty happy about what John Elway did as a general manager of the Broncos. Yeah, the second half of that wasn't great. He got tired of it. He walked away. But you got a Super Bowl, 1 Super Bowl title, and 2 Super Bowl appearances. Hell of a run.
Yeah, it almost speaks to the potential importance of having GMs who have played before. I mean, especially obviously with the quarterback position, and Elway and Manning is a specific example, but it almost points to the fact that, hey, maybe having someone who's been there, done that, and has been on the other side is a great advantage when you're trying to recruit some of these free agents to come play for you.
Yeah, I mean, look, you have to have some way to sell people to overcome whatever their questions are. And all circumstances are different. You develop trust in different ways. General managers develop the ability to communicate with people in all sorts of different ways, and you see how it goes. But Elway had one thing that Peyton, could relate to, and that was critical at that time, at that juncture, and that's why, as to allude to what you said before at the beginning of this, there is a serendipity about how things come together, and they come together for a reason. Um, but they have to come together. If not for certain circumstances that happened way back when, in the 1970s in Pullman, Washington, you don't get what happens in Denver in 2015, right? It just doesn't happen. So it's fascinating. It's interesting. It's great to watch. It's great theater. And I was, privileged to get to write about it. And I do say privileged to get to write about it.
As we close the chapter on Elway, I feel like this is taken directly from your book, and I did not know this fact. But Elway is the second man in NFL history to win a championship, make the Hall of Fame as a player, and then win a championship as a head coach or executive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that perfectly summarizes the brilliance of Elway, both as a player and later on as an executive.
Yep. Mike Ditka is the other one, as noted. Hopefully your boy John Lynch becomes another one. So with the 49ers, I'm a John Lynch fan since he's a Stanford guy.
Yep.
But it's rare company, because it's rare that people who have achieved that much as a player want to put themselves on the line and try and achieve that as an executive, because it's hard. Most guys in this life live off their past as much as they can, and just go off and play golf and do a bunch of speeches and say, God, I had a great career as a player. There are very few people who are willing to step in there and either coach or become executives and put their reputation on the line. And Elway is one of those few. Elway made it work. Very, it's very impressive stuff. And again, that's one of the reasons why I wrote about him.
What did Elway tell John Lynch? Because didn't Lynch call Elway? I think you wrote about it in your book to ask if he should take the
Can I,
49ers job.
can I swear on your podcast?
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. It's like he'd been talking, and he was talking for advice about it. And I think Lynch called him and said, "Yeah, I think I'm really going to take this 49ers job." And Lynch been in broadcasting, and Elway doesn't have a lot of respect for broadcasting. He just doesn't think much of it. And he says, and Elway had a couple of pops before this, so he was loose when he said it. But he goes, "Yeah, it's about time you do something with your fucking life." Um, yeah, John Lynch. Yeah, it's about time you do something with your little fucking life, John. Yeah, you only had a Hall of Fame career. You only played
Yeah,
16 years. You only, you're only part of one of the greatest defenses of all time. You're only one of the best broadcasters, in the business. You're, only an MBA. I think you have a business degree from Stanford. You got a Stanford degree. You haven't done anything. It's about time you do something with your life. Yeah, that's what Elway said to John Lynch. It was perfect.
yeah.
Lynch loves it. He laughs about
John, you loser. That's
it.
fantastic.
Yeah. Only guys who reach that kind of level can say that to each other. You know,
Right,
and
right.
kind of mean it. Really, kind of
Yep,
mean it.
yep. Jason, I've taken up too much of your time already, but I do have one last question, and it
Sure.
has to do with your experience as a selector for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. You've been doing it since 2013, and I got to tell you, the whole Hall of Fame selection process is one big black box to me,
Uh,
and I'm sure it is
it
for a
is.
lot of
It is
people.
to me,
So,
and I'm part of it. So
so great. So this is gonna be great.
yeah.
Let's start here. What actually goes into the whole process? Like, how does one select a player to go into the Hall of Fame, and what do you consider?
Um, well, yeah. I mean, you obviously look at accomplishments, resume. Just to go through it in another process. There's a whittling down of there's a big list of about 150 players every year who are eligible. That gets whittled down to eventually 25. It gets whittled from 25 to 15. And then we meet in January, a few weeks before the Super Bowl. That's how we do it now. We used to meet on the Saturday before the Super Bowl, but they changed it recently. And so we meet a few weeks before the Super Bowl, and we spend it's about 8 to 10, 12 hours meeting and talking about the resumes of these guys who are eligible, to be voted into the Hall of Fame, and also the contributor candidates, the coaches, the owners, all those people. But the main discussion is the um, 15 modern era guys. And when you're vetting those 15, I mean, look, you're looking at the resumes, you're assigning what do you think, you're thinking about what did my eyes tell me about that player that I watched for his career, and then you're assessing them and rating them against each other. And different people have different opinions, and there's 50 of us in that room, and we're arguing it out and discussing it and eventually voting on it. And I wouldn't say there's a lot of disagreement. I wouldn't call it disagreeable. I mean, we're not shouting at each other, calling each other idiots, because again, I mean, keep perspective on this. Arguing about one great player versus another great player. They're both great players. Um, it's hard. And I know there's a lot of frustration, a lot of disagreement. I know that different fans think different things and they think we're idiots and we get it wrong every single year. And I hear that. And a lot of people say the process is imperfect, it's wrong, that players should vote, these people should do it. And I always come back to it and say, look, no matter what system you put in front of us, whether it's 400 people voting the way that Major League Baseball does it, whether it's former players voting, or reporters voting, or media members voting, or some mixture of guys, no matter what system you put out there, it's always going to be imperfect. I can poke holes in every single system that you ever put out there. I hear from a lot of people, oh, only ex players and guys who've been on the field should vote for the Hall of Fame. Can I tell you this? Do you know how many players don't watch football when they're done? And certainly don't watch it in a way that they're studying it. And I'm talking about even Hall of Famers. They just don't pay attention. So, as much as you want to tell me that only those guys should vote, I'm going to tell you I would spend more time watching football than they do. And I really think about it through. Not every single one of them, but a lot of them. And I would also submit that if you only made it Hall of Famers who got to vote on Hall of Famers, almost nobody would ever get in. Because most Hall of Famers don't think that the guys who are on the ballot are worth a crap. Because they all think that they're better than each other, right? And, if Deion Sanders, let me tell you right now, if Deion Sanders was in charge of the Hall of Fame process, then you'd be lucky for one guy to make it every year. That's just how it is. Okay. So don't, you know, I fully admit that the process is flawed, but I also say right off the bat, every single process is flawed and every one of them is frustrating. And every one of them is, as you refer to, a black box. Why does it happen? What is the mystery that happened inside that room? And I can't talk about that kind of stuff. That's privileged. I can talk about my opinions on guys. It's my opinion, but I can't share what the discussion is specifically. But I will say this: the people who are in there take it very, very seriously and are trying to do the best that they possibly can but it is, at the end of the day, their opinion as well.
Has there been a player in particular that was especially difficult for you to evaluate and decide on?
I mean, obviously, Terrell Owens was a tough one. Um, Warren Sapp was a bit of a tough one. I mean, Warren Sapp was my first year, so I went along with it a little bit with Warren Sapp and didn't necessarily agree that he should be a first ballot guy, but he got in. Um, Terrell Owens. Every year that I do this, I do a survey of at least 400 people who played the game. So I try to incorporate the opinion of people who played the game, either played it or coached it or were executives. And for long term, like for 10, 15, 20 years. So I've got a long list of people that I contact every year and a lot of Hall of Famers. There's probably 25 Hall of Famers among those 400 who I contact and ask for their opinion. And so I'm trying really, really hard to measure it. I will say that the first 2 years that Tio was on the ballot, he was never in the top five of the list of the 15. He made the top five in the third year. And so when people say, "Oh, you guys were just trying to screw him over and this and that," nah, really weren't. Not everybody agreed. Now maybe Tio should have been a first ballot Hall of Famer. He wasn't, and that's just the way it goes. And he cried about it and he whined about it. Um, and and there was a lot of disagreement, a lot of argument, but that was a tough one to consider. I would say that there have been some other guys, Paul Tagliabue, who I did not vote for the year, and he got in when they changed the voting process. But Paul Tagliabue was a really difficult guy. I probably struggled the most um, with my decision on whether I was going to vote for Tagliabue or not, and I ended up not voting for Tagliabue. And he didn't make it that particular year. He eventually got in later on. That guy was a really, really big struggle for me. Um, those are the ones who those are the two in the 11 years I've done it. Those were the two that were the toughest. And Warren Sapp again wasn't so much a tough one um, as I thought that Michael Strahan was probably a little bit more deserving.
One last question. Maybe this will be difficult. Maybe not. I guess we'll see. But I thought it'd be interesting, just playing off the Hall of Fame thing. If I gave you 5 quarterbacks and you tell me whether or not they deserve to be in the Hall of Fame,
Sure, go ahead,
and
shoot it,
I think
shoot.
these are some. I think these are some fringe cases. So it'll be interesting to hear your opinion.
Mhm.
So starting at the top, Matt Ryan,
I would say no.
no Hall
Close.
of Fame.
No, but no Hall of Fame. Good player. Um, Not quite great enough, but might get in. Might get in, but I didn't think he was quite good enough.
Would he get in just based off his stats,
Yeah, I
or
mean he might get in off of his stats, but I don't think he was. Um, Even if he had won the Super Bowl that year, it would have helped his case. But always thought he was slightly above average, very good player, not great player.
Philip Rivers?
A little bit better than Matt Ryan, a little bit better shot in my view than Matt Ryan. Tough guy, interesting guy, um, better thrower of the football than you would ever think based on his throwing motion, his mechanics. Probably a better player than Dan Fouts, who played in the same organization and also made it. Yeah, I'd be. It's close, but I think I would give an edge to yes, Rivers being it.
I saw some guy comment on Reddit. He was like, if there was ever a statue to be built for a player that was really good, just like really good, not excellent, it would be Philip Rivers.
That's
That would be
fair.
like
I
the
mean,
poster child.
I'm not. If he doesn't, let me just say this: if Philip Rivers doesn't make it, I won't be surprised.
Hmm.
But if you're asking me, and it will also depend on who else is on the ballot. But I would say, you know, it's sort of like 55-45. 55. I'm 55% in, 45% not. Whereas if you're talking about Matt Ryan, I'm sort of 40-60.
Big Ben.
Hall of Famer. Not a great human, but Hall of Famer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the stats, right? Just what he was able to
The,
do with
the
Pittsburgh. I
accomplishment,
mean, it's
the accomplishment, the toughness,
yeah.
the Super Bowls. I mean, Super Bowls matter. I mean, a lot of people are like, oh, he was on a great team. He was lucky. Yeah, well, the goal of playing football is to win titles. It's not to generate stats. Like you're here, you're here to try and win titles, and he did it. He held up as his end of the bargain. They won titles.
Two more to round us out here. Both who are still playing, actually, and one of them is playing tonight. Russell Wilson.
I'm probably a little more than Matt Ryan, maybe equal to Philip Rivers. It will somehow depend on how does he change the arc of his career, because the arc of his career is not going well. The arc of his career is going sort of like what happened to Donovan McNabb at the end of his career, where he just was really, really, really good doing this and posting all these great seasons. Then all of a sudden it went just like that and crashed. And I don't like the arc of his career.
So it's almost like I guess the logic is that arc would outweigh the Super Bowl
Well, so, see,
win
because
in a
yeah, it
way.
may, it may. Um, Again, it's a tough one with Russell Wilson, and I kind of measure him off of Philip Rivers. I like him more than Philip Rivers, or less than Philip Rivers? And it probably depends on what day you talk to me. But he has more of his career to write, if that's fair.
I just love that Philip Rivers is like the litmus test. It's like
Oh,
Philip Rivers is right
yeah,
on the edge,
yeah.
and it's like if you're a little bit above, you're in. If you're a little bit below Philip Rivers, you're out. I feel like
Eh,
that just describes Philip Rivers perfectly.
yeah, well, it is. I mean, it's just kind of like when I'd mentioned Alex Smith before. I used to say Alex Smith was the perfect like league average quarterback for starters, who a guy who can get you to the playoffs consistently, run your team for you, do a lot of really good things, and you're going to be competitive with a guy like Alex Smith, and especially when after they went through the first 7 years where it was just craziness with his offensive coordinators, and when you got him with a good coach and you got him in a good system. He was terrific with San Francisco during that Super Bowl run. Until Kaepernick took over, he was terrific in Kansas City, but he was never going to take you over the top. So that's like the league average starter, and you always want to get a little bit better. When you're talking about the Hall of Fame, Philip Rivers is kind of that guy. Like he's right on the cusp. Do you put him in or do you not put him in?
Who would you rather have, Alex Smith or Brock Purdy?
Um, Brock Purdy. I think there's better anticipation, there's better accuracy with Brock Purdy. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and I think there's probably actually a little bit better arm with Brock Purdy. Brock can't throw the ball downfield. But again, if you tell me I'm running my team with Alex Smith, I'll take my shot. I'm not in love with it, but I'll take my shot, and I think I can probably win. All right, who's your last guy? Who you throwing at me?
Matthew Stafford.
Probably Matthew Stafford is kind of a freak of nature, and really once he got to the Rams and got freed from the stench of Detroit, um, we saw what he was really truly capable of. He's really great arm. He's not quite Aaron Rodgers in terms of arms, the ability to manipulate the ball and do amazing things, but he's not far removed from that as one of the great throwers of all time. So I would say I would side towards yes with with Matthew Stafford. Um, so yeah, that's he's. I think he's a better player than Rivers was. To use the Philip Rivers measuring stick, as we've sort of established in this conversation. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's not firm. I mean, like it's not an absolute. And I would love to hear what the counter arguments are. And it's not really counter arguments. Like nobody's ever going to say that, oh, Matthew Stafford's terrible and he doesn't deserve to get in. It's oftentimes like, who else is on the ballot? And are we like who's better than Matthew Stafford on the ballot? That's what it comes down to a lot of times. It's like what does the rest of the ballot look like in a given year? And by the way, I'm surprised you didn't ask me about Eli Manning. So um, I guess we're not going to get into that hornet's nest.
Well, I wanted to be respectful of your time, Jason, but if you want to get into the hornet's nest real quick, I
I
will
think he's going to
not.
make it. I'll say this just to answer my own thing. I think Eli's going to make it. I would be so shocked if he makes it on the first ballot. He's eligible this year. I just, I I love Eli Manning on a personal basis, and I think Eli had a great perspective that was perfect for working in New York. And I will say this: he held up his end of the bargain. All right, if you say to me, "I'm going to take a quarterback and we're going to win 2 Super Bowls with him at quarterback," like that's a hell of a thing. Like that's awesome. Like you'll say, "I'm on board with that." The only problem with Eli Manning, and I've said this many, many times, so it's kind of an old line at this point. He played a lot of his career as if he was waking up on a Saturday morning at a frat house after a mega kegger on Friday night. And you just didn't know you were going out to play that intramural game and you didn't know if you were going to get 5 touchdowns or 5 interceptions, man. You just didn't know because you just didn't know what condition of hangover the dude was going to be in, right? Like you weren't quite sure. But did know this, and I'll say this for Eli again. In his defense, like he showed up, man. That he showed up and he gave you everything he had. He didn't bitch. He didn't complain. When he got booed, he didn't cry. He didn't whine. Um, when the teammates, complained, he didn't bitch, he didn't whine, he didn't cry. He took it and he took it in stride. And I'll say this: that's tough, man, because New York, being a quarterback on a New York football team, can destroy you. It really, truly can. Being a New York athlete, period, can destroy you because the negativity can destroy you. And he handled it incredibly well.
Yeah, we've seen it. I mean, we've seen it recently with so many New York quarterbacks too. We mentioned Darnold, Zach Wilson.
Look at the
It's
Jets' history.
it's
Just look at the history of Jets quarterbacks since Joe Willie.
yeah,
Not a lot of guys any good. Chad Pennington is about as good as it gets. Chad was a tough-minded kid. Um, not many of them able to handle playing in New York under those bright lights.
yeah. Well, my takeaway from this conversation, Jason, is that Philip Rivers is the litmus test for the Hall of Fame, and that Eli Manning. I love that analogy about Eli Manning because it describes. It's just perfect. I was laughing the entire time because it's so perfect. It's just, I mean, you don't know what you're getting. You might be beating the Patriots, or you might be throwing, 5 picks, like you said. So,
Because he did
in
it, man. He did it. He threw 5 picks. I think it was against
yeah,
Minnesota one day. He did, or Philly. I can't remember what game it was, but he did it, man. But he also threw a couple, the throw to Manningham, the throw in the other game to David Tyree. The whole the playoff performance in both of those seasons, if you go back and you look at it, um, is just exquisite. It's just like he was on point every single game during those both those playoff runs. Um, and I would say this: I would argue Eli was probably a better athlete than his brother, than Peyton. Um, he just wasn't as maniacal or as probably OCD. Like there's no question he's not as OCD as Peyton. Um, just not even close. Peyton was a creation of his own OCD, but Eli didn't have any of that, and I will say that it served him well, um, not being OCD, being in New York. Because if he had been OCD in New York, he probably would have melted down.
No, that's a good point. That's a really good point. Jason, on that note, we're coming up on 2 hours here. I can't thank you enough for your time. We've touched on everything and anything in between John Elway and quarterbacks and the 49ers. I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. Elway by Jason Cole. Highly recommend you go pick it up wherever you can get books. I picked up my copy on Amazon. Amazon does this like overnight delivery thing now, which is fantastic. Like you get it between like 4 and 8 a.m. Just exquisite. Amazon's great. Just I'll plug for Amazon, not that they need it, but
Yeah, Jeff Bezos
Jason,
doesn't need more help. So you're doing
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, yeah. I think he's
It's been
fine.
fun, Nick. I appreciate it very much, and thank you for the plug on the book and a good conversation. It was really fun.
Absolutely. Before we leave, Jason, where can people find you and more of your work?
I work in the 33rd team now. I'm also working on other books and other projects, so I'm not as ever present as I once was in the world of NFL journalism. But I'll be there. You'll see my work somewhere down the line. Don't worry. But 33rd team is where I'll have a column out this week. I think I like to call yards per play differential, which is a way of ranking teams that doesn't come down to wins and losses. It's another statistical measure, and it's a pretty good preview of how the season is going to play out and who's going to win the Super Bowl.
Well, listen, if you have any more books in your future, we're gonna have to bring you back on to
Oh, I
talk
do.
about it.
I do.
So,
You'll see me again.
well,
Don't worry.
all right. Well, to that, Jason, thanks again for coming on. Wishing you all the best, man.
Thanks, man. Likewise. Take care, Nick.